Don't have the money to buy 500 units from your wholesale supplier, and do you wish you could order less upfront from your factory? Well, here's the exact process that I use to negotiate down the minimum order quantities for my first bulk order of private label products. Now, the minimum order quantity is the lowest quantity of products or services that a supplier is willing to produce or provide. Now, every supplier will have different MOQs for different products, and there are different size factories that cater to different size businesses. Now, some suppliers might have an MOQ of 1,000 units, while others might have an MOQ of 10,000 units. The minimum order quantity will vary depending on the supplier and the product or service being offered. Now, if you find that your factories are quoting you extremely high MOQs, then that factory is likely out of your league. You should look for factories that work with businesses your size. Now, you might think that this is unfair, but when it comes to working with factories, it doesn't make sense for a manufacturer to produce items for you unless they can make money on the transaction. Now, if you think about a factory as an assembly line, it's not cost effective for a manufacturer to create a brand new process for your product unless you can exceed a certain volume threshold. After all, manufacturers must bear the large upfront costs of training, machinery, and tooling. Now, making money with your own private label products is all about scale, and you have to be willing to meet a factory's MOQ in order to get the lowest prices possible for your products. Now, as I mentioned earlier, every vendor is going to have a different MOQ for a given type of product. Some wholesale suppliers only work in extremely large quantities, whereas other vendors are willing to sell you as few as 100 units at a time. And this MOQ is dictated by the type of vendor that you're working with. Now, are you working with a factory? A factory is a type of supplier that actually manufactures your products for sale. In an ideal world, you want to work with the manufacturer directly because your prices are going to be lower, there's going to be no middlemen and no additional markups. You can create custom products and quickly make adjustments during the manufacturing process. But the main downside of working with a factory is that they have higher MOQs. In addition, it's often difficult to work with a factory directly because it requires navigating through a maze of complex relationships. For example, many factories in China won't even talk to you unless you go through a rep or a sourcing agent. Now, that being said, if you can buy product in larger quantities, then working with a factory is the best way to get the lowest prices possible. You can also work with a trading company. A trading company doesn't actually make their own products. Instead, they work with multiple factories to create products for their clients. They already have close relationships in place with trusted manufacturers and act as a middleman to facilitate product creation. Now, the main benefit of going with the trading company is that they can offer you lower MOQs and a much larger product selection. Because they work with multiple factories across many different disciplines, they can often help you with a variety of your sourcing needs. Now, the downside, of course, is that they're going to be more expensive. In addition, you have less control over the details of your final product because all communication with the factory must go through the trading company. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter whether you work with a factory or a trading company as long as you can make a decent profit with your goods. In fact, finding the right supplier is often a self-selecting process. After all, you may not be able to meet the MOQ of a factory, and a factory may not even be willing to speak with you unless you have the right relationships in place. Now, over the years running my store over at Bumblebee Linens, I've worked with both factories and trading companies with great success, and your order size will dictate who you get to work with. Now, once you have more purchasing power, you can gradually work your way up the chain and push down your product costs. Now, how do you find the MOQ? Well, you just ask. Here's the sample script that I use. Hi vendor, my name is Steve and I'm the purchasing agent for Bumblebee Linens, a store in the US that sells handkerchiefs. We're interested in carrying many of the items that you have to offer. I would like to get pricing and availability for the following items. Please send pricing in 500, 1,000, and 5,000 unit quantities. And if you could send us your product catalogs, lead times, and MOQ, we would greatly appreciate it. Now, one thing you'll notice about the letter I just talked about is that I specifically asked for pricing in 500, 1,000, and 5,000 unit quantities. And I use these numbers to feel out the supplier. If the vendor is not in my league, then they won't even reply. On the flip side, attaching real numbers to my initial request lets the vendor know that I'm serious about purchasing in quantity. Now, depending on whether you're working with a large factory, a small-time manufacturer, or a trading company, you'll often receive a variety of MOQs from your suppliers, and some are just going to be way too high, and you should simply ignore these suppliers altogether. They are clearly out of your league. Some MOQs will be suspiciously low, which generally means that you can get a better deal elsewhere. Now, the key is to work with a supplier that is within your range in terms of MOQ and price. For example, if a supplier has an MOQ of 500 units and you're willing to buy 300 or 400 units, well, then that's well within the ballpark. But if you are off by more than a factor of 2 or 3, then I'd probably move on. Now, here's how to negotiate your MOQs down. Now, if you're in the ballpark of a supplier's MOQ, then there are a variety of tactics that you can use. However, the effectiveness of these strategies that I'm about to talk about largely depend on whether the supplier respects you as a buyer. If the supplier does not believe that you're legit, then they will likely not negotiate with you at all. In fact, they may ignore you altogether or give you prices that are ridiculously high to make you go away. Therefore, the first big tip that I have to give is to always act larger than you really are. Project a sense of confidence in your communications. Show the supplier that you know what you're doing, even if you are a beginner. Because think about it this way. Every good supplier is bombarded with hundreds of sourcing requests day in and day out, and you must stand out. So do your research and try to not ask any boneheaded questions that can be Googled. So here's tactic number 1. Try to close the deal right away. Now, in some cases, a vendor will give you a high MOQ, but they might be willing to produce less units upfront if they think that you're going to be a long-term customer. Now, for my store, there have been occasions where I couldn't meet the MOQ, but I was willing to pay for 60% of the units immediately and upfront. Now, typical payment terms are 30% down and 17% upon completion, but when we directly asked for their bank information and offered to wire them the money immediately, the supplier took the deal. Negotiating tactic number 2, offer to pay a higher price. Now, when it comes to negotiating with a vendor, it often comes down to the money and not the actual MOQ. Now, if producing less units makes sense financially for the supplier, then they'll likely go for it. As a result, it's about finding that middle ground where both parties are satisfied. Now, one thing that I like to do is offer to pay higher prices for less units. For example, if the MOQ is 500 units at $1 a piece, I might offer to buy 300 units at $1.25 a piece. Now, if you're in the ballpark of a vendor's profit requirement, you can sometimes get them to agree to a lower MOQ. Here's negotiating tactic number 3, offer to increase the overall order size. Now, this strategy is generally more applicable if you're trying to purchase many different styles of the exact same product. Now, with my company, we often purchase our handkerchiefs in a variety of different colors, but in general, each style carries its own MOQ. For example, we have to purchase a minimum amount of ivory hankies to make the cost of the dyeing process worth it to the vendor. Now, because we don't sell nearly as many ivory hankies as we do white handkerchiefs, we simply offer to increase our overall order of white hankies by a certain percentage to offset the cost, and usually that's enough to sway the vendor to waive the MOQ for our ivory hankies. Once again, it all comes down to the money. Negotiating tactic number 4, paying in installments. Now, if you can't pay for a supplier's MOQ all in one shot, then it's worth asking if they will produce the entire production run and ship you your order in installments. For example, if their MOQ is 1,000 units, then offer to pay for half upfront and then the remaining half in 3 months. Not every vendor will be willing to do this, and once again, it all hinges on whether the vendor respects you as a company. If they believe that you're good for the money, then they may agree to this arrangement, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Now, what do you do when you exceed the MOQ? Now, ironically, one of the biggest mistakes that I see my students make is that they don't order enough product for their first order. For example, one of my students was extremely conservative and only ordered 500 units for their initial shipment. But she ended up selling all 500 units in a single month and missed out on the entire holiday shopping season. Now, whether or not you feel comfortable placing larger orders is your prerogative. But eventually, your e-commerce business will outgrow your existing MOQ, and it's in your best interest to renegotiate. In general, you should ask for lower pricing whenever you meet a new quantity threshold. And this threshold is largely determined by the type of product that you sell. Now, if you start out ordering 500 units and all of a sudden you're placing orders of 1,000 or 2,000 units, then you should definitely try to negotiate for lower pricing. In fact, I would argue that you should make a habit of asking for lower pricing no matter what. After all, if you do not ask, you will not receive. Now, if you have a good relationship with your vendor, they'll be willing to work with you to find a mutually beneficial price. Now, here's some gotchas when negotiating. Whenever you negotiate with a supplier, you have to be extremely careful with quality control. Some vendors want your business so badly that they're willing to negotiate only to end up compromising on the quality of your products. One time, we struck a fantastic deal with a vendor for a shipment of hankies only to find that they used a much thinner and lower quality fabric. Now, the way to combat quality control attrition is to create a quality control checklist and use an inspector in China to inspect the goods before they are shipped. A quality control checklist is a document that specifies every minute detail about the product that you're trying to source. For example, whenever we purchase linen napkins, we specify the width, the exact measurements, the exact color, and then we give this checklist along with a golden sample of our product to an inspector that we hire in China. Following these 2 steps will ensure that your products will arrive with the quality that you expect. Now, when it comes to minimum order quantities, it can be frustrating to find a vendor that meets your pricing and quantity requirements, but rest assured, there is a supplier out there that caters to the size of your business. Now remember, running an e-commerce business is an iterative process and you have to gradually work your way up to the top. Start out small with a low MOQ supplier until your business gets some traction, and then reinvest your profits with factories to get better pricing. Hope you enjoyed this video. Now if you like what you saw, there's actually a lot more where that came from if you subscribe to my channel below. And if you are interested in learning how to sell physical products online, then click over here and take my free 6-day mini course where I'll walk you through everything that you need to know to get started in e-commerce. Thanks for watching.